Hello, I'm Bill Haslam, part of the Vanderbilt Project for Unity and Democracy, and I'm really pleased to have a guest with us today, Will Hurd, former U.S. Congressman, former CIA officer, tech expert. There's a lot of parts of his resume that I think are interesting. So we could be here a while, but we won't take all the time to talk about. But Will, thanks, and welcome to Tennessee.
Hey, it's always a pleasure, and I appreciate the invite.
Good. We're glad to have you here. As we always say, there wouldn't be a Texas without Tennessee. So welcome back home.
That's right.
All right, let me start with this. Your book, American Reboot, it is a book heavy on policy in a world where policy's not really in favor. Politics and rhetoric are the kind of the currency of the day, if you will. Why'd you write a book about policy?
Well, look, I would agree with you, right? Most people are chasing clicks. They're chasing eyeballs on television. But one of the things the reason I ran for Congress was because I was frustrated with the system. And the reason I kept getting elected in Congress is because I told the folks that represented me, here's what I'm gonna do, and then grade me on whether or not I did it. And so I was able to win in one of the toughest districts in the country because we produce things. And the reason that you're seeing a lack of trust in many of our institutions is because people don't think those institutions are doing anything for them.
Yeah.
Why are businesses the last institutions that have any kind of trust from the population? Because guess what? They have to deliver a good or service at a specific time. If we get back to this notion of delivering for the people that we represent, we're going to see those trust numbers improve. And it was what the secret of my success was. So why not write about it?
So I'm going to circle back around to that. So that's really good. A little bit about you personally. I mean, like I said, fascinating background. Black father, white mother. You ran in a largely Hispanic district, lots to talk about there. You don't fit the profile of a Republican. Well, let me start there. We'll come back and talk about some of the faults of the party, but thinking like, well, why are you a Republican?
Well, my dad, who was born in East Texas, and he's 89 years old now.
Wow.
He always says he's been a Republican since Lincoln freed us, right? and it goes back to that. But my parents, my dad was a salesman, and he sold notions. And when I was in middle school, him and my mom decided to open up their own business, right? And so I saw them, bootstrap a beauty supply business and then create a beauty school. And so those principles that kind of were at the time the foundation of the Republican Party, I saw that firsthand. Then I go to Texas A&M University, right? Conservative university. I was involved in student politics.
You stand up for the whole football game?
We do.
Okay.
We do. And look, I got to know then George W. Bush, the governor. Rick Perry was the agriculture commissioner before he became governor.
Aggie himself.
Yeah. And then also I got to know Bob Gates. Right. He was interim head of the Bush School at the time.
Yeah.
Went on to be Secretary of Defense. He had already been the CIA director.
Right.
And then also George H.W. Bush was heavily involved at Texas A&M's campus.
Sure.
So I had an exposure to conservative leaders early in my formidable years, and then spending time, a decade as an undercover officer in the CIA, where I was recruiting spies and stealing secrets. Right, best job on the planet.
Yeah, we're going to hear about that too, by the way.
That was so. The importance of America's role in the rest of the world, the importance of foreign policy, having an aggressive foreign policy, all of those things were what has influenced me. Now, I wasn't reciting the Constitution when I was 4 years old or things like that, but that is what the influence I had. And then ultimately, I think historically, the Republican Party has been a simple formula. Freedom leads to opportunity. Opportunity leads to growth. Growth leads to progress, right? Now, we've gotten away from some of those things, but that fundamental formula, I truly believe and experience that at every phase of my life.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, the market-based economy, the idea that America has a leading role in the world, those are the fundamental things. But, if we're going to talk about change, I always say you should start with yourself. And so as two Republicans, we should talk about how do we get here? to where you said some of the things that are the bedrock principles of the party aren't necessarily what we practice now. And definitely we've kind of lost the policy orientation, if you will. How did we get here?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors, right, that have led us to this point. But if I were to highlight just one, like if I had a magic wand and I can change it, it's the primary process. Ultimately, 3% of a population is deciding a lot of seats. And let's take the 2020 election. Only 34 House seats were competitive. And I say competitive, that means split party, where people voted for one party of president and the other party of Congress. 34.
Right. Out of
435.
Right.
If you go back to 2000, that number was north of 70.
Right.
If you go back to 1980, that number was north of 150. Right? And so decisions were being made in the past in the general election in November, not during the primary. And then if you also go back to our last non-presidential election, again, I'm talking about the House, the average number of voters that decided the winner of a primary was 54,000 people.
Yeah.
So 27,001 people were deciding 92% of the House seats. And this logic applies to every other seat below the House. Now, statewide races, it's a little bit different, but you're seeing this kind of the same trends. Not enough people voting in primaries. And so what happens is when people get elected, they only talk to those 3% of voters that got them elected within the primary. Let's look across the country. People are winning with only 30% of the vote. That is not reflective of a majority of society. And so those are some of the structural changes. And then I would argue that because people running for office stop talking to all those other people, they stop coming out to vote.
And I would add to that, then you add the whole Twitterverse that we live in the middle of now, and if they look, the active people are the same small percentage of folks, primarily on the far right and the far left. And so one of the things that politicians learn, you learn to read the room, right? You go in, you're speaking to an Optimist club or a Rotary club in San Antonio versus I'm in a small town and I'm talking about agriculture issues. In a good way, you learn to read the room, but unfortunately, the result is you read the room and you're only hearing these voices that are on the very edges.
Sure, and then we try to nationalize everything.
Right.
Because I was always in a competitive seat, national reporters would always want to come and be on the campaign trail with me during my elections. And I used to do this thing called DC to DQ.
Right.
I would go to all the Dairy Queens in the district. Here's great. Look, all these counties, they had one Dairy Queen. Everybody knew where it was. You didn't have to put the address.
Ice cream when you were done.
Ice cream.
It's like,
It's great.
Called it work.
Yeah, exactly. And called it work, right. And the reporters, I'd say, listen, you get the last 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And every national reporter would, in essence, berate the crowd because they're like, you didn't ask about this topic. You didn't ask about this. And those national reporters were talking about whatever, the DC crowd was talking about, whatever was being talked about on Twitter. And that was not reflective of what real people cared about. And so this attempt to nationalize everything, no, people care about the crummy roads in their neighborhood.
Yep.
They want to make sure their school their kids are going to has computer science education, so they're ready for the next thing, right? And so we need to move away from trying to nationalize everything.
I mean, I've always said the best way to learn what people care about is run for office, stand on 20,000 front doors, porches that you knocked on the door, and you hear, here's what people really care about. So you're right.
Yeah, Governor, but here's what I found, right? Whether I was in deep blue El Paso, or the ruby red parts of San Antonio, people cared about the same thing.
Yeah.
They cared about putting food on their table, a roof over their head, and taking care of the people that they love. Yeah. And when you talk about those issues, you're going to see you'd see a change in behavior, but we don't talk about those, unfortunately.
So I want to let's take in. I think the other reason I think that policy doesn't get talked about is two things. One, both sides make hay off of a problem that's not solved, And then number two, it's hard to solve problems,
Yeah.
right? So the example I always use is immigration, and it's a great one for you because you have a district that reflects a lot of the real issues. So let's take a hard issue like that. I always say with immigration, you know, Republicans can say the Democrats just want to let everybody over the border. Democrats are saying Republicans want to keep kids in cages. Solving it is really hard, but I actually think is doable. So let's take a policy issue like that. You get to take a leadership role. All of a sudden, you went to being Speaker of the House, and they said, "Hey, let's chart a course here. Show us a course on solving the immigration issue."
Sure. Well, thanks for getting my blood pressure up.
Yeah.
Because this was an important issue for
Sure.
me, and it was one of those things where I took a number of swings at and was unsuccessful. So immigration is one of those issues that you have to address what's happening at the time. So right now, today, the issue, the crisis at the border is real.
Right.
The amount of illegal immigration that's coming into our country is at the highest it's ever been. That's not my opinions. That's what the current Secretary of Homeland Security for President Biden has said. And it's gotten so bad that even the mayors of New York City and Washington, D.C. are saying, hey, we got to do something at the border because now it's starting to impact us. So the first step, we have to stop treating everybody that's coming into the country illegally as an asylum seeker.
Right.
Asylum is a very specific thing, and we're misinterpreting it. And yes, there are some people that have asylum, but when you look over the last 30 years, only about somewhere between 12 to 20% of people that apply for asylum actually get granted asylum. It's a very small number. So asylum means you are being persecuted. So first off, you're part of a protected class, and two, you're being persecuted because you're part of that protected class. So we have to stop treating everybody as asylum seekers. That's point one. Point two, if you address that a pull factor, right? Then you have to start worrying about putting the right kind of technology along the border. A lot of us saw those pictures of the people that were in that truck and they died of heat exhaustion.
Right.
It's terrible. I've spoken to some of the firemen and police officers that saw that, and they're like, that's something nobody should ever see.
Right.
Why do we not have the kinds of technology along the border to detect that kind of thing? The technology exists, and so we need not only just put the right technology in between our points of entry, but we need to have them at our points of entry. So that would be kind of step two, making sure we have the right tool.
Can I ask you a question? Because there's a lot of folks said, we can build a wall with technology. And can we do that? And if so, why haven't we?
We have, and we've started.
Okay.
Right, and this is probably a new phenomenon over probably the last year and a half of the Trump administration, and it's still going on under the current administration. And the reason you do need a physical barrier in some places, usually where there's urban contact, but there are some parts of the border. And I had 820 miles of it, more than anybody else.
Right.
There are some parts of the border where for Border Patrol to respond to a threat, their response time is measured in hours to days.
Right.
If your response time is measured in hours to days, a wall is actually not a physical barrier.
Right.
You need to be able to detect illegal activity, track that illegal activity so that you can
The point being,
interdict.
it's going to take them 8 hours, a nice ladder, and I'm done.
Yeah, you're done.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, the technology can be improved in order for us to have operational control, meaning we know everything that comes back and forth across the border. So address the asylum issue, deal with the actual tools along the border, and the third thing we need to do is streamline legal immigration. The reality is, I don't care what industry you're in.
Yeah.
You are dying for workers.
True.
It's in this day and age, we should be able to have a system that says, okay, this month, Florida needs X many hospitality workers. Texas needs Y amount of agriculture workers. We should be able to have a system that's based on need. Right. So streamline legal immigration.
Right.
And then we have to address the historical reasons that illegal immigration has come this way. And that's primarily in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Now, today, because of the volume of illegal traffic, it's coming from all over the place. But historically, 80% has come from those three countries. So we need to be addressing the economic reasons in those places, lack of economic opportunity, extreme poverty, and crime. Help those countries address those problems so that their citizens can stay there, right? Those are the efforts that we can take. And guess what? Democratic primary voters and Republican primary voters, if you go poll all of them on this, 70% of them agree. I think them like the Dreamers. This is an issue that 70% of Republican primary voters, to include Trump voters, believe these kids that have only known the United States of America as their home should have a legal pathway to stay here. Right? The reason it doesn't get done is what you alluded to at the very beginning. Both sides would rather use this as a political bludgeon than solving this problem. However, those things that I've outlined can be passed. The rank and file in the House would be willing to vote on something like this, but it's the leadership of both parties that have prevented these things from coming forward.
So let me I'm going to shift gears, but it's related. You spent how long as a CIA officer?
9.5 years.
Okay, I want to come back to that. But when you then came to D.C., and were there ever moments of this weird juxtaposition, like I have been, and I know other people that have literally been putting their lives at risk for democracy, for this idea of America, and I get here to Congress and people are treating it flippantly, or this might not be the right word, but
no, I think it's the right word, and the answer is yes, right? Like they were, people are advocating for the things that my friends and I were putting our life on the line in order to defend. And so was it frustrating? Absolutely. And a lot of people would always come to me and say, hey, Will, because also on top of that, a lot of people like to the intelligence community sometimes is the dog people like to kick, right? Because the intelligence community doesn't fight back. They don't get on Twitter and refute things, or they don't go on CNN and rebut, right? But what I would always tell folks that were saying, what's going on, here's what I know about the folks, the men and women in the intelligence community. They're professionals. They're doing their job, regardless of the noise that's on social media, that's in Washington, D.C. They're going out and doing their job. And so that's why I'm proud to have come from that community and try to reflect them in those things that I did when I was in Congress.
Let's stay there with CIA. What made you do that, and what are the things that someone like, whether it's me or the folks listening, what would surprise me about what your job looked like? The parts you can tell us.
Sure. So look, why did I do it? I was a computer science major.
Okay.
I'm walking across campus, my freshman year in college. I had never really been outside of Texas. And I see a sign to take 2 journalism classes in Mexico City for $425.
Okay.
I had $450 in my bank account, so I go to Mexico. Fell in love.
What'd you do with the other $25?
Yeah, look, like that was pocket change, right? I was walking around money, and what was it was cool being in places I'd never been in. I'd read about in books.
Right.
I had international studies as a minor. First class I took, I had this CIA tough guy tell these amazing stories. And I was like, I want to do that. The idea of serving my country in exotic places was fascinating.
Sure.
I did 2 years in D.C. in training, 2 years in India, 2 years in Pakistan, 2 years in New York City doing interagency work, and then 1.5 years in Afghanistan.
Okay.
I never would have thought that I would have lived in India or Pakistan. Sure. And it was an exciting job. And what I would say is that if most people knew how small our intelligence services were, and that we do not have the luxury. The president, CIA director says, we need to figure this out. We can't say, boss, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough money, we just don't have the time to do it. The answer is yes, we'll get after it. And so that commitment to the mission and the willingness to put your family, right, yourself ultimately in harm's way, is what is the hallmark of those folks, that they knew they were doing it. But every night there are men and women that are doing things that could be a movie. And it was, like I said, it was the best job, because you got to work on the most important national security issues of the day. And look, I've traveled. It was funny. I recently was in Europe, and I was in a country that it was the first time I had been there, and the previous time I had been in alias. Right, I had a number of alias personas, and I was like, am I going to be okay? It turned out okay. But to be able to even be in a situation to do those kinds of things on behalf of your country was exciting.
There's I encourage folks to read the book. There's a great story of you trying to bump a contact, which is to make a contact, hopefully to bring them onto our side, but at a ski slope, which is you end up with a little bit of a yard sale in the snow, as they say. So, but you later do make the connection. So,
yeah, and like you do it in fascinating places.
Yeah.
Look, I was in Pakistan when the Danish cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad came out.
Right, yeah.
And that created protests all over the world, and tens of thousands of people were about to march on the embassy our embassy in Islamabad, and I had to go into the crowd. And so that one was a little bit more harrowing than trying to bump a target on a ski slope, right? But to be able to go from one to the other, it was just an exciting career, and it was an exciting time.
I want to circle back to policy and politics in the country. But one question, as we record this, the United States just revealed they finally got al-Zarqawi. I'm not saying al-Zarqawi. Zawahiri, excuse me. Thank you. And it feels like we've always had a technology advantage over the bad guys. Are we always going to have that technology advantage?
No,
we're not. What happens when we don't?
We're not, and that's the scary part, right? And we can see that I've seen the last image we had of Bin Laden. I believe it was in 2002. We had the technical capability that got leaked, and guess what? That's when Bin Laden went underground and never used an electronic device again. The fact that Zawahiri is in the capital of Afghanistan, in a residence owned by the Minister of Interior, right? That's crazy. But yes, the capability exists. But right now, the biggest concern is going to be between us and the Chinese government. The Chinese government, people still want to describe them as a near peer.
Right.
They are a peer.
Right.
There's no question. They are 4 times the size of the United States. So just with that alone means the United States has to be 4 times more effective than the Chinese government has to be. And so let's take a technology like quantum computing. Quantum computing is still, we have not reached quantum supremacy where a quantum computer is going to be able to do something that a high-speed traditional computer is able to do. But once somebody achieves quantum supremacy, it's probably going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to give that person the ability to decrypt every kinds of communication that has ever been produced. So that's your bank information, that's how the SEC transmits information, all of those things. Right. So imagine the Chinese government gets that first. That first mover advantage is going to be fantastic. And so that's from a nation state. But then what you're also seeing when it comes to things like cyber tools, they have been created by governments, but now criminal organizations and enterprises are using it. You can buy the tools to conduct ransomware on the dark web. So this moves out of the capabilities of nation states to then any other kind of actor. So we're going to start seeing an increase of those crime organizations using some of those tools. So it's scary. And the last one I'd say is artificial intelligence. the future of cybersecurity conflicts is going to be good AI, good artificial intelligence versus bad artificial intelligence. And the United States has benefited for being a leader in all of these technologies since the aftermath of World War II. If we do not maintain that level of leadership and dominance, we will get surpassed as the global superpower.
So given that, let's just say you got to give a State of the Union speech to Congress, and you're after 40 rounds of applause, you're standing there in front of the entire assembly. What's your message on that? What are you saying to make certain people hear?
Look, my message is going to be something around the kind of message John F. Kennedy had about space.
Okay.
Right, and the need to achieve these things. And I'd probably outline two things. I'd say the United States of America is going to achieve quantum supremacy in 3 years,
Okay.
4 years. We're also going to defend against it. You and I are old enough to remember Y2K.
Right?
Everybody was worried that when Y2K happened, our digital infrastructures would stop. It didn't. It was a big nothing.
Yep.
Why? Because it took 4 years and $1 trillion to prepare for that.
Right.
That's the kind of level of investment and focus we need to do. When it comes to artificial intelligence, we're going to say the United States, the government and the private sector is going to have unparalleled cooperation. We're going to get some great entrepreneurs and business leaders to come into the government at a senior level to help us drive some of these technologies. We're going to share data, as much data as we can, protecting the privacy of individuals to make sure those that are developing the algorithms that we need for these tools that is being trained with as much data as we possibly can. And we're going to work with our allies, because the only way that we're going to make sure that America stays a leader in advanced technology is if we're working with our allies, and primarily Europe. And we can't be fighting over things like privacy. So those are some of the things that I would outline. Oh, and by the way, every 7th and 8th grader in the United States of America is going to learn how to code.
Right.
That is the basics of understanding all these future technologies, and the sooner we introduce that, the better. Right now, the number of high schools, I think the number it's low in the 30% of high schools that have a computer science class. The numbers for middle schools is even lower. That has to change, because that is the building block learning that is necessary for us to stay competitive.
Let's circle back to one of the things we're trying to work on here at this project at Vanderbilt. How do we get back to I agree with you on the cause. You know, the way the primary system, the lack of competitive districts, I hear people all the time say, I see more and more people like are becoming independents. Is that a good thing? And I say, well, actually it's not, because they're abandoning the primary process where the decisions are getting made. So how do we get back to effective governing?
So the professional political class tells candidates, talk to those likely primary voters. That feeds this momentum.
No question.
The individuals that have the willingness to talk to those folks that are being left out, it's hard. It takes more time.
Right.
It takes more money. That's actually the real opportunity. And so it's going to require some politicians and people running for office that are willing to have those kinds of conversations. It's also going to require people that are currently in office to practice what they preach. If you're going to say you're representing everybody, do things that's reflective of everyone, not just focus on that 3% that we talked about earlier. And look, it comes down to leadership. We need people that are willing to inspire rather than fearmonger. Fear-mongering works, don't get me wrong. You see it happening every single day. But we need people that are willing to take those tough decisions. And look, here's what I've learned. The older you get, the more consequences there are to doing the right thing. But the longer you do the right thing, the easier it is to do the right thing. But you also got to know what the right thing is to do. And so this seems philosophical, but that's ultimately what we need to do. There are many opportunities, even now, in one of the most hyper-partisan environments. The fact that Congress was able to pass a CHIPS Act, right, where making sure that we're bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States. The fact that during the pandemic we were able to pass bills to make sure the country was helpful to get through it. There are even now still some of those kinds of examples, even on something as tricky and tough as gun violence. The fact that bipartisan bills were passed in the environment that we're in. So it can happen, but it needs to be consistent, and it needs to be, people need to build their organizations and their campaigns around solving those problems.
Makes sense. One of the things that has historically held us back as a country is race. And it feels to me you have a unique perspective, like I said, with black father, white mother, Hispanic district. If you got to stand up again and give an address on race, what would you say?
Look, say slavery existed. It happened. Jim Crow happened, right? Policies that grew out of Jim Crow had impacts on communities, and those impacts are still being felt today. But many of the people that are alive and working today are not the ones that necessarily contributed to that. We can recognize these things in the past and not be afraid to have to deal with it, right? And it starts with that. I can honestly say, right, my father, couldn't, when he would tell the story when he first voted in East Texas, he would have to drop his ballot in a barrel. And at the end of the day, people burnt that barrel. That is not happening today. And so we can't be afraid to have these conversations or admit the past problems. It's okay. When people admit that, it's not saying that you're participating in it. I think that's the first step. I think the next thing is we got to focus on education. When you look at why do we have income inequality in many communities, communities of color, it's because you have education inequality. And making sure that we focus on that. And in Texas, there's been a number of longitudinal studies about how giving school choice and letting parents decide where to take their kids has eliminated the achievement gap. And when you do that, then we're going to get beyond many of these problems.
As we look to wrap up, having been in the political world like you for a while, and when I talk to people, they tend to make have one of three reactions to the whole political. One is to assimilate, like, well, it's just the way the world is, so I'm going to go ahead and play that game. The second is they just withdraw. And they say, a pox on both of their houses. I'm tired of the Republicans, Democrats. I'm just out of here. And the third, and what I try to encourage, is that they actually engage. How do you encourage people who just say, I'm over it? Well, thanks. I loved I loved your service. You were great, but that's just not the way the world works. I'm out of here. What do you say to them?
Well, I'd start and tell them that, say, guess what? Democracy is fragile. Always has been fragile, always will be fragile. The reason America was called an experiment was because nobody thought it was going to work.
Right.
There hadn't been democracy on the planet for 1,800 years.
Right.
Last one was Rome. Julius Caesar screwed that up,
right,
when he became emperor. There was not another democracy for 60 years, Switzerland, after we started, and there's only been 14 democracies that have existed for more than 100 years.
Right.
This is and the novelty of this was that we said, hey, the people are sovereign, not the government. And the only way this thing exists and works is if people participate. And so with that individual who's bringing up this issue, I would focus on the one thing that they probably care about and say, okay, if that is what you care about, here's how your government is going to impact you. And do you want to leave a country, a world worse off
Right.
for your kids than the one you inherited.
Right.
And guess what? The level of work we have to do to keep this experiment operating for another 247 years is not as hard as what some of our predecessors had to do. We're not having to storm the beaches of Normandy. We're not having to fight at Lexington. We're not having to go in hand-to-hand combat in the fortresses of Mazar-e Sharif, right? And so for us, it's about participating in a process that many people have fought for us to have, and so do it.
Two final questions that we try to ask our guests here. What gives you hope? Well, when you look at American democracy, and we can talk about, you wrote a great book talking a lot of the issues. Give us something that gives you hope.
There's two things. This narrative that exists about like college students and, they're soft and, they're afraid to have, debate. That hasn't been my experience. And so I am always fascinated by young people that, man, they're so much smarter than we were when we were at that age, that are excited about solving problems. That makes me feel good. I also now, I thought I understood technology when I was in Congress.
Yeah.
I see these people that are on the cutting edge,
Yeah.
doing things that sound like science fiction, that is going to have such a tectonic improvement of society.
Yeah.
I see that stuff every day, and I feel good. So look, things might get worse before they get better, but I do believe that our best days are still ahead of us.
One of the things we talk about here again is we're looking for unity, not unanimity. Unanimity was never the goal of America, or a realistic goal. Is there something that you can say is inspiring unity across the country today?
It's inspiring unity across the country today. Look, I actually think this. I don't want to just talk about the need of technology and focusing on technology, but the fact that Republicans and Democrats were able to do something that 20 years ago the population probably would not have been supportive of, in order to move the country forward. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal, and it's a specific example of how we can solve tough problems.
Well, thank you. I think one of the things that causes unity is people look around and they see selfless service in a world that sometimes feels overly selfish, in a world that feels kind of all about I, me, and you have a life that's obviously shown that. You put your own life personally at risk with the CIA, and then you went and political process, which I always tell people, having your name be on the ballot is a lot harder than you think. So your willingness to do that is significant.
You're too kind. And Bill, I'm gonna revise and extend my remarks on the previous question. The thing that I think there's unity on. Okay. The support in the United States of America towards Ukraine. I've been floored by that. Because prior to the second invasion of Ukraine, the population was not supportive. Right. And did not want to, they said, hey, that's somewhere very far away. The fact that when we started seeing images of a bully trying to extend their own, a will on a population, that Americans stood up, that people are still, waving and flying Ukrainian flags. And this is Republicans and Democrats. Yeah, of course, not everybody's in agreement, but the fact that the supermajority of the country has to help somebody 7,000 miles away, that has been a pretty fascinating and uplifting experience over these last few months.
I agree. I was just in Eastern Europe, in a country that's several hundred miles away, but much closer, where the reality of it feels much more present, and the sense and fear there reminded me how important it is to live in a place that's free. These were people who had a memory of not being free.
Absolutely.
And they saw that and felt that. So all the more reason I appreciate folks like you who have served the way you have. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. It's been fun. I encourage people to read American Reboot. I think you'll be encouraged, not just by the tone of the book, but that there's some specific policy ideas in a world that seems a little policy light these days. Well done.
Thank you.